Scott Grayson was in Tampa yesterday. It was hot down there, man. It looked hot. And he's got Grayson's grades and some reaction from the locker room. He wrote a piece at 973ESPN.com regarding the reaction in the locker room, because there was a report yesterday that Wentz was going to be cleared and ready to go for this Sunday, and Scott went around the room getting people's reaction. So now that we know that is the reaction, did it seem pretty evident that the players, Scott, knew yesterday what we found out today?
Yeah, in talking to them, none of them would come out and say it. So their words didn't indicate for sure that he was coming, but the body language and just kind of hearing the tone with which everything was said, especially with Zach Ertz and Lane Johnson, just kind of made it sound like, they kind of knew that he was coming back. I think it's going to give him a shot in the arm, but you have to worry about who's he going to throw the ball to now that you don't know if Jeffrey's back, and you don't know, obviously, Mike Wallace is going to be missing for a little while. So, Wentz will definitely give this team a jolt, but you got to wonder how they'll end up performing as an offensive unit with him out there. I think it's definitely a much-needed shot in the arm.
And obviously you just brought up the problem with wide receiver. We don't know when Jeffrey's going to be back. Wallace looks like he's going to be out a while. They got Gibson and Carter and Aiken. Obviously, they weren't big play guys yesterday. Do the Eagles go outside the organization, or do they stick with what they have? And obviously the names that keep coming up, Josh Gordon, who the Browns are going to let go, and then Dez Bryant would be the other big name. I can't think of another wide receiver that's available that would do anything to improve this team.
Yeah, well, you always worry about what you infuse into the locker room when you feel like you have a good core. And I think that this organization showed last year they have a good core, and you worry about adding too many personalities, in quotes. And I think both those guys are those personalities that you just wonder how they would mix in here. So you hesitate a little bit. Now, it's funny because sitting behind me, kind of diagonally behind me in the press box yesterday was Joe Douglas. And I kept looking at him and thinking, I wonder what's going through his head right now as he was watching with Wallace out, no Jeffrey, the receivers that were on the field, and thinking if there's got to be something done. And then I saw Howie Roseman in the locker room, and you could, not that Howie ever looks like he's not concerned about something at any given time, but there was just a little bit of concern on his face walking around in the locker room. And I kept thinking, I wonder what they're going to do about this wide receiver position. And, that's my fear with a Dez Bryant or a Josh Gordon. You're potentially bringing in a personality with potential issues, and you wonder how will that work in there. And then what happens when Wallace and Jeffrey are both back? Is there suddenly not enough footballs to go around that creates a problem as well? So I think they're trying to balance all that out and figure that out. That clearly they've got to get somebody out there, because right now if Jeffrey's not back this week without Wallace, you're just lacking some of that. Yeah, it helps to have Wentz back there, but like Zach Ertz said, he can't be Superman back there and expected to do everything all by himself.
Scott Grayson, Grayson's grades are posted at 973ESPN.com. Let me ask you, you were down there. What was the locker room like? Like, this is the first time they've lost a game of any meaning in quite some time.
Yeah, it was, but you know what? The guys mentioned it, and it was kind of brought up that they were 1-1 a year ago. There definitely was no sense of panic. There was nobody pointing fingers. All the things that kind of happened last year whenever they lost a game, it was we did this to ourselves. Obviously, a lot of the guys on defense were taking responsibility for the big plays, breaking them. They understand what they have to do better in that side of it. They also took, I think, a positive away from the fact that they kept fighting all the way to the end, had the ball down by 6 at the end of the game, and were close, but not close enough to get it done. So there was no panic. There was no sense of that. I did walk out of there feeling that kind of calm frustration, if you will, that you kind of experienced whenever they lost a game last year. So definitely not a panic button being pushed, not any kind of finger pointing, like I said. And they want to get back and clean up the mistakes they made as they come home to to face Indianapolis. And it is worth pointing out, this defense has really not done well, even going back to last year on the road. It continued again last week. So I think it's just what the doctor ordered to get Carson Wentz back, a shot in the arm in front of the home fans this Sunday against the Colts.
Scott Grayson, his grades are posted. Let's go to some of the grades. Doug Pederson, a C. A lot of people thought that the team did not seem to be very prepared. What did you think of Doug? You gave him a C yesterday. A lot of people would have said hey, I thought the team was that got out coached a little bit.
Well, I think it's hard to point that on or to put that on Doug when he's missing. At one point, I tweeted out a shot of the depth chart with lines through the guys who were not available. And when you look at that, who's who that's missing, hard to really, I think with Wallace going down, you missed Jay Ajayi in the first half. Jason Peters out. I got to believe half of the game plan had to be ripped up because you just didn't have the personnel to do what you wanted to do. So I think he was really, for the most part, just trying to manage whatever he could with who he had out there.
I thought Barrett Brooks brought up a very interesting point on the postgame, Scott. He said that they're not running the RPOs for Nick, and essentially his reasoning was that was an indication that Carson was going to be ready sooner than later because they wanted the receivers to run the regular routes and not the routes, for Foles. They wanted him to be running the routes for Carson.
I would agree with that. I think that
we have not seen a lot of the RPO.
No, we have not, and I don't understand why they did. I mean, because you want to win with what you got, and what you got for Nick Foles is that's what works. That's his bread and butter. That's kind of what gets him going. Now, his numbers yesterday were not bad, but he had to throw the ball so much because they got behind early. And I still think Doug is not calling relatively close to balanced kind of games. He still is putting the ball in the air a lot. And with Peters not there and Vaitai struggling, that was a little questionable in my mind. But, yeah, I mean, they're not running those RPOs. And I think you're right. I think a lot of it's because they kind of knew that week 3 was going to be circled for Wentz to come back.
Scott, Mike asked you about the vibes in the locker room coming off a loss that they haven't experienced in quite some time. And you said overall they were upbeat. They weren't pointing fingers. But Jalen Mills, who got beat on that 75-yard touchdown to open up the game, he tweeted out after the game last night, "I see all the chatter. Don't worry. Keep the same energy coming." It seemed like he was a little bit bitter seeing all the negativity that was surrounding his play yesterday. So talk about Jalen Mills, the grade that you gave him of a C, and what you saw from him and even him in the locker room after the game.
So I didn't see anything from him in the locker room that made me, think that he was bitter. I saw frustration. I think what happened is everybody blamed him on that first, play to Deshaun Jackson, went the distance. And I think that, if you watch that play, I think he was expecting underneath help from Malcolm Jenkins and didn't get it. And so I think he's kind of the guy who got burned on Twitter by everybody, and it wasn't necessarily his fault. I don't, he did miss a tackle. Deshaun Jackson definitely made him look silly towards the end of that play. But, I think he should have had the help from Malcolm Jenkins there, and I think that's where some of that is coming from, some of the, the being defensive on Jalen Mills' part. But, yeah, I mean, I just, you cannot give up those plays. You had to know, and they all admitted they knew that Deshaun Jackson was going to look to get deep on them, and they weren't necessarily surprised it happened on the first play. But then if that's the case, how do you give it up? So there's definitely some issues there that they have to get cleaned up. And I think that's some of what, they were all talking about as a defense in general that they were going to look to clean up through film work is some of that happened to them. Because they hadn't, obviously Atlanta had Julio Jones, and they did a good job of keeping him in front of them. But this team with Evans and Deshaun Jackson, it certainly stretched the Eagles out a little more. So they got to fix some of that.
Yeah, you mentioned Malcolm Jenkins. Let's go to him. The guy that was supposed to have the coverage over the top there on that big play to Deshaun Jackson wasn't there to weather the storm with that huge opening touchdown. He came out after the game and said, "That's my fault. I got to do a better job. I'm 100% to blame. I'll be better moving forward." What'd you see from Malcolm Jenkins, another guy that you gave a C on the Grayson's grades to?
Well, when I talked about the locker room and kind of the core in here and there's no finger pointing, that's part of it. I think, Malcolm Jenkins is part of that, and leadership in that locker room. They take ownership of their mistakes when they make them, for the most part, and he did that yesterday. I gave him a C. I would have given him a lower grade had he not ended up forcing that fumble. When it's time for him to make a big play near the end of the game, he seems to do it. It's just, there's got to make sure they shore up that communication and can't give up those kind of big plays that, look, so far it looks like Jim Schwartz's defense this year is going to be kind of a bend but not break kind of defense. Yesterday they broke too often, and there was no bending involved because on these big chunk plays they had already broken. So if they can clean that up, I think that this defense can get back on track without a problem. But, Malcolm Jenkins, like you said, took ownership of his mistake. Just one mistake, one play, 75-yard touchdown, 7-0 Tampa, 11 seconds into the game. That hurts.
Yeah, we were talking a lot after the win against Atlanta about Jordan Hicks, who looked absolutely brilliant coming off a big injury in his first game back. Dominated, looked like the new leader of the defense. He was mic'd up. I saw a lot of those clips. He looked good. And then yesterday, he was up and down. You gave him a C on your Grayson's grades. Talk about what you saw from Jordan Hicks.
Yeah, a little bit of an up and down kind of game from him. On the one O.J. Howard touchdown that went the distance, Hicks to me had pretty good coverage, but he failed to kind of get him down once the pass was caught, and then Howard also ended up getting through and making a long touchdown on the play. There was also some miscommunication with Rodney McLeod, left wide open Chris Godwin in the back of the end zone for one of the touchdowns there. Miscommunication is kind of the key word I keep using here. The defense was not on the same page a lot, and several guys were involved. In this case, it was Jordan Hicks and Rodney McLeod. But when they had the play and Malcolm Jenkins stripped the ball, Hicks was there to pick up the fumble and return it in the midfield. So, and Jordan Hicks, I think, is still very good. He's definitely, obviously, the leader on that defense in the middle of that linebacking core. And, it was one of those games, not one of his better ones, but, I gave him a C because of the fumble recovery at the end and looking to make a play. And I just think he's got some miscommunication skills or things there that they've got to get cleaned up as the defense in general does. I really think it's going to be I would love to be a fly on the wall in the film session today at NovaCare with those defensive guys, because a lot of miscommunication, you can't have that in this league.
Would love to be a fly in the wall inside the Joe Douglas, Howie Roseman camp as well to see if they're talking about getting a wide receiver. Not a lot of options out there. Josh Gordon could be traded. Dez Bryant is a free agent. Either of those two guys would be the top of the list, but we'll see if there's any news there. And if there is, we'll have it for you here on the Sports Bash 97.3 ESPN. Scott Grayson, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. Thanks, Scott.
All right, thanks, guys.